The woman who hired me to photograph her villa in Capri did not meet me at the door. Her housekeeper did, a woman in her 60s named Renata, who looked at me the way people who have worked for very wealthy women look at the latest stranger their employer has summoned, with the polite blank face of a person who has decided in advance not to know my name by Friday. She took my coat. She took my equipment bag. She did not take my camera, which I had kept around my neck the way I always do when I arrive somewhere new, because the camera is the part of me that does the speaking when the rest of me has not yet decided what to say. La signora ti aspetta in biblioteca, Renata said. The signora was Vittoria Carrera. I knew the name the way most people in my world knew the name. I had been hired through 3 intermediaries. The contract had been negotiated by a lawyer in Milan who had asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement before I was even told the location of the shoot. I had signed it. I had been paid half up front. The half that had landed in my account had been more than I made in most quarters, and I had not asked questions about the other half, because the other half was the kind of money you do not ask questions about until you have been in the room with the person paying it. If you want to hear the longer, bolder version of this story, the one I cannot tell on YouTube, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The library was at the end of a hallway that had been built before my country had been a country. The floor was old marble, worn smooth in 2 paths by feet that had walked it for 200 years. The walls were the color of butter. The light came from a window that looked over the cliff and the sea and the white blur of Capri in the distance. There was no overhead fixture. There was no electric light at all. There was only the window and the sea light coming through it, and the woman standing with her back to me in front of it. She did not turn when I came in. "Miss Voss," she said. She said it the way people say a name they have already decided what to do with. "Signora Carrera," I said. "Vittoria, please. We are going to be in a great deal of close quarters this week. Surnames will become tedious." She turned then. She was perhaps 43, 44. She wore dark trousers and a cream silk blouse, with the cuffs turned once at her wrists, in a way I had only ever seen on women who had been taught the gesture by their mothers and had never bothered to learn another. Her hair was the color of dark wood and was pulled back in a low knot at the base of her neck. Her eyes were a gray that did not commit to a color in the sea light. She held a glass of something amber in her left hand and a book in her right. She set the book down on a small table beside her without looking at the table. The book landed exactly where she had decided it would land. I had the impression she had not in many years put a book down anywhere it had not landed exactly where she had decided. She crossed the room toward me. She did not extend her hand. She walked instead in a slow half-circle around me, the way I had once seen a buyer at an auction walk around a horse. She looked at my camera. She looked at my boots. She looked at the strap of my bag where it had pressed a faint diagonal line into the cotton of my shirt. She did not look at my face until she had completed the circle and was standing in front of me again. She said, "You are smaller than I expected." She said, "There is also a dark room on the lower floor of the east wing. It was my father's. It has not been used in 11 years. You will develop everything there. I do not want digital files. I do not want anything cloud-based. I do not want the photographs to exist on any server I have not personally authorized." I said, "I shoot digital and film. I can shoot the entire week on film if you prefer." She said, "I prefer." I said, "All right." She said, "I have laid in supplies, chemicals, paper, fixer. Whatever you need that I have not anticipated, You will tell Renata, and Renata will produce it within 4 hours. There is no inconvenience here you cannot solve by asking. I said, thank you. She said, there is also no door in the east wing that you will open without permission. The darkroom is the room at the end of the hall on the left. The hall has 6 other doors. 5 of them are not for you. Are we clear? I said, we are clear. She said, good. She walked back to the table beside the window. She picked up her glass. She did not drink from it. She held it the way she had been holding it when I came in, the way a woman holds a glass when she has poured it for company that has not yet arrived. I had the sudden displaced thought that she had poured it before I had walked in, because she had wanted to be holding something when I walked in. I filed the thought away. I would need it later. I did not yet know when later was. She said, Renata will show you to your room. You will rest tonight. We begin tomorrow at 6. I assume you keep early hours. I said, I do. She said, then we will get on. I left the library. Renata was waiting in the hallway, as if she had been positioned there by a stage director. She led me up a flight of stairs and through 2 corridors to a door that opened onto a room with a sea view, a writing desk, and a bed that had been made by someone who had been trained to make beds in a previous century. There was a small bowl of figs on the desk. There was a bottle of water. There was a key on the bedside table that Renata told me was the key to the East Wing darkroom. She said, La signora pensa a tutto. I said, I am beginning to understand. Renata almost smiled. Tomorrow at 6, she said. She closed the door. I stood in the room with my camera still around my neck. The window was open, and I could hear the sea below the cliff and the small high sound of swallows. I crossed to the desk. I picked up the key. It was heavier than it needed to be. The teeth of it were old, the kind that had been cut by a craftsman and not a machine. I held it in my hand for a long second. I put it in my pocket. I went to the window. The light over the water was the color of copper and was beginning to bend toward the sea. I realized, 3 hours of golden hour ahead of me, and I had been told to begin tomorrow at 6, and I had not been told I could not photograph anything tonight. I had also not been told I could. I made the kind of small decision a photographer makes 100 times in a career, which was to interpret the absence of a prohibition as a permission, and to go outside. I went down the back stairs. I went out through a door that opened onto the gardens. The gardens were terraced. The terraces fell down the cliff in 3 levels, each one held up by a low stone wall the color of bone. There were lemon trees and a long pergola covered in something that was about to flower, and a small reflecting pool that held the sky. I lifted the camera. I shot for 40 minutes. I did not photograph the villa. I photographed the gardens, the wall, the pergola, the way the light fell on the surface of the water in the reflecting pool the second before the wind moved it. I did not photograph any door. I did not photograph any window. I did not photograph anything that could be construed as the inside of her house. When I looked up from the viewfinder, she was standing on the upper terrace. She was leaning on the stone balustrade with both hands. She had changed. She was wearing a long silk dress the color of old wine that fell from her shoulders to the floor. Her feet were bare. Her hair was down. The sea wind had moved it once and was about to move it again. She was watching me. She had been watching me, I understood, for longer than I had been aware of being watched. She did not move when I saw her. She did not look away. She held my eyes from 40 feet up and across 2 terraces in the last light of the day, and she did not look away, and after a long second, I lowered the camera. Not because she had told me to, because something in the line of her shoulders had told me that whatever came next was not for the camera to see. She said, in a voice that carried in the way a voice carries, in a place built to carry it. I did not give you permission to photograph this evening. I said, I did not photograph the house. She said, I did not say the house. I said this evening. I said, I am sorry. She said, come up here. I went up. I climbed the stone steps from the lower terrace to the middle, and from the middle to the upper. By the time I reached her, the sun was below the line of the sea, and the sky was the color of a peach that had been split open. She had not moved. She was still leaning on the balustrade with both hands. I stopped 4 feet from her. She said, closer. I came 1 step closer. She said, closer. I came 1 more. I was now near enough to see that her eyes had a small fleck of green at the edge of the gray. I had not been able to see that from the library. I had not been able to see that from the lower terrace. I had been able to see it for perhaps 10 seconds, and I would, I understood already, be able to see it for the rest of my life. She said, you photographed without permission. I said, I will delete what I shot. She said, you shoot film. I said, I will burn the roll. She said, you will not. You will develop it, in my darkroom tonight, and you will bring me each print as it dries, and I will look at them, and I will decide what happens to each one. Is that clear? I said, yes. She said, yes, what? I said, yes, Vittoria. She held my eyes for a beat. The corner of her mouth did not move. Something behind her eyes did. The same small displacement I had seen in the library, when she had said, of course you did, after I told her I had taken the photographs of myself. A private acknowledgement of a thing she had decided to know. She said, go. I went. The darkroom was at the end of the hall, on the left, exactly where she had said it would be. The key turned in the lock the way old keys turn, with the small grinding resistance of a mechanism that has not been used in 11 years and has decided to remember its work. The door opened onto a room that smelled the way every dark room in the world smells, of acetic acid and old paper, and something underneath both of those that is harder to name and is always the same. The smell of a small enclosed place where light has been kept out on purpose for a long time. I closed the door behind me. I turned on the safe light. The room came into the dim red, the way dark rooms always come into the dim red. The enlarger, the trays, the tongs, the clothesline, the bottles of Stop Bath and Fixer that someone, presumably Renata, had laid out in the order I would need them. There was a small radio on the shelf above the trays. There was a stool. There was a glass of water that someone had set next to the stool, because someone had thought about the fact that I would be in here for several hours and would get thirsty. The someone, I understood, was not Renata. Renata did not put glasses of water in the room of a woman she had not yet decided whether to like. The someone was Vittoria. The glass had been set there before I had ever come up the cliff. I exhaled. I had been holding my breath without knowing. I loaded the roll. I set the timer. I worked. There is a particular state a photographer goes into in the dark. The hands do the work. The hands have done the work 10,000 times. The mind floats up out of the hands and goes wherever it goes. My mind that night went to the woman on the upper terrace in the wine-colored dress, with her bare feet on the warm stone, and her hair the way the wind had left it, watching me with a kind of attention I had not been on the receiving end of in a long time. I tried to put the attention into a category. I tried to call it surveillance. I tried to call it appraisal. I tried to call it the look of a client checking on the work of a contractor on her property. None of the names fit. I lowered the first negative into the developer. I watched the image come up. The first image was the lemon tree on the lower terrace. I had shot it from below. The leaves were dark against the bright sky. The lemons were hard and pale. It was a good photograph. It was a photograph by someone who had been doing this for a long time. I worked through the roll, the lemon tree, the wall, the pergola, the reflecting pool before the wind, the reflecting pool after the wind, the shadow of the pergola on the gravel path, the figure of a stone woman set into a niche in the wall I had not even seen until I was already photographing it, the light through a row of cypresses, the sea between two cypress trunks, the chair I had not sat in, the bowl of figs I had not eaten, the small low bench I had passed without noticing. The last frame was not from the gardens. The last frame was Vittoria. I had not known I had taken it. I had not raised the camera at her on the upper terrace. I had not framed her in the viewfinder. I had not focused. I had not pressed the shutter that I could remember pressing. And yet, there she was, in the developer, coming up out of the chemistry the way every image comes up, her body in the wine-colored dress, her bare feet on the warm stone, her hands on the balustrade, her face turned toward me, her eyes already on me. The frame was wide. I had clearly shot it from the lower terrace. I had clearly shot it before she had spoken. I had clearly, my hands had clearly, my body had clearly taken a photograph of her without my mind having been informed. I stood in the safe light and looked at the print floating in the developer, and I understood with a slow internal cold that I had been told to develop the roll because she had known, because she had counted the frames I had taken in the gardens and counted the frames on a 36 exposure roll and known there was an extra one, because she had stood on the upper terrace and watched me come up and asked me how many frames I had shot, even though she had not asked me, because she had said, I will look at each one and decide what happens to each one, because she had wanted to see the photograph I had taken without knowing I had taken it. I lifted the print out of the developer with the tongs. I moved it to the stop bath. I moved it to the fixer. I rinsed it. I clipped it to the line. I clipped each print to the line in the order I had taken them, because the order felt important now. The lemon tree first, the wall, the pergola, the pool before, the pool after, the shadow, the stone woman, the cypresses, the chair, the fids, the bench, Vittoria last. I looked at the line of prints for a long second in the red light. I understood then that the assignment for the rest of the week was not the villa. The assignment was the conversation that was about to begin between this photograph and the woman in the dress. I took the prints down. I stacked them. I put a sheet of glassine between each one. I climbed the stairs out of the east wing. I knocked on the door of the library. She said, "Come in." I came in. She had not changed out of the wine-colored dress. She was sitting in a deep armchair near the cold fireplace. There was no fire. The room was warm enough without it. The lamps had been lit, the small ones with the low bulbs that produced the kind of light I knew well from photographing dinners in old houses for clients I had liked less than I was beginning to like this one. She was reading. She looked up. She set the book down without a marker. I crossed the room. I held out the stack of prints. She did not take them. She said, "Sit." I sat in the chair across from her. She said, "Set them on the table, between us, top to bottom, in the order you took them." I did. She leaned forward. She did not pick the prints up. She turned them over one at a time with the tip of her index finger, the way a woman who has been around art for a long time turns pages of a portfolio, with care, without owning the work yet, without committing to liking it. She looked at each photograph for a long second. She did not speak. She turned the lemon tree over. She turned the wall over. She turned the pergola, the pool, the shadow, the stone woman, the cypresses, the chair, the figs, the bench. She did not turn the last one. She looked at it. She looked at it for what was perhaps 30 seconds. I had been counting, because I had to count something, and the seconds were the only thing in the room available to count. At 31, she lifted her eyes from the print to my face. She said, "You did not know you took this." She said, "I believe you." I said, "Thank you." She said, "That is not a courtesy. I am telling you a fact about myself. I believe you." I said, "All right." She said, "Do you know why?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "Because the photograph is not flattering. The photograph is true. A flatterer does not produce a photograph like this without knowing they have produced it. A flatterer would have framed me higher. A flatterer would have softened the line of my mouth. A flatterer would have caught me a half second before I was looking at the camera, not the half second after. You did not flatter me because you did not know I was your subject. The photograph was taken by your hands, not by you. The hands knew before you did." I said, "I am not sure that is how photography works." She said, "It is how this photograph works." She set her finger on the corner of the print. She did not lift it. She did not slide it. She held the corner down with her finger, as if to keep the photograph from leaving the table. She said, "What are you going to do with this print?" I said, "Whatever you tell me to do with it." She said, "What if I tell you to get it to me?" I said, "I will give it to you." She said, "What if I tell you to burn it?" I said, "I will burn it." She said, "What if I tell you to keep it?" I said, "Then I will keep it." She said, "What if I tell you to make me a copy and keep one and give me one?" I said, "I will do that as well." She said, "Why are you not negotiating?" I said, "Because I took the photograph in your house without permission, and you have offered me 4 options, all of which are reasonable, and 3 of which are kinder than I deserve." She said, "You believe you do not deserve kindness." I said, "I believe I do not deserve it on this particular question." She said, "I see." She lifted her finger. She slid the photograph an inch toward herself. She said, "I am keeping this one." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am also keeping the next 5 you take of me." I said, "I have not been hired to photograph you." She said, "You have now." I said, "All right." She said, "I will sit for you tomorrow afternoon. In this room. 2 o'clock. You will bring the camera you used tonight. You will bring the same film. You will use the natural light. You will not direct me. You will not move me. You will photograph what is in front of you, and you will not flatter." I said, "I have never flattered." She said, "I know." She sat back in her chair. She picked up the book. She did not open it. She said, "Go to bed, Dahlia." It was the first time she had used my first name. I said, "Good night, Vittoria." She said, "Good night." I went up the stairs to the room I had been given. I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. The window was open. The sea was making the sound the sea makes at night when there is no other sound in the world to compete with it. I thought about the photograph she had kept. I thought about the photograph she had said she would let me take of her tomorrow at 2. I thought about the way she had said, "The hands knew before you did," and about how no client had ever in my life said anything to me that was more accurate or more dangerous in the same sentence. I did not sleep until almost 3. In the morning, at 6, I was on the cliff with the camera. The sun came up the way sunrises come up in places that have been letting the sun come up over them for 2,000 years, with a kind of confidence I have not encountered in younger landscapes. I shot for 90 minutes. I shot the boathouse from above. I shot the chapel from the path. I shot the long blue line of the sea from a small stone bench halfway down the cliff that I had the strong sense had been put there for someone in particular 2 centuries ago and had been used by every woman in this family since. At 8, I came back up. Renata had laid out coffee and bread and figs and a small dish of honey on a table in the courtyard. Vittoria was not there. Vittoria, Renata told me, took her morning coffee in her room and did not come downstairs until 10. I ate. I drank the coffee. The coffee was the kind of coffee that ruins a person for other coffee. I did not photograph the coffee. I had been told I could photograph the gardens, but I had not been told I could photograph the breakfast. And I had decided overnight, going to be a person who asked. I worked through the morning on the chapel. I worked through the early afternoon on the cellars. The cellars were 3 levels under the villa and were cool and dry and smelled of stone and old wood and something faintly green I could not identify. There were bottles in the cellars older than my country. I photographed them. I did not ask why she had asked me to photograph them, because I had begun to understand that with this woman, the photographs were not for an audience. The photographs were for her. The photographs were the way she was teaching me to look at her things, and through her things, at her. At 2, I went to the library. She was sitting in the chair where she had been sitting the night before. She was wearing different clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, no jewelry except the platinum watch I had seen on her wrist the first day. Her hair was down. The library was full of the slow yellow light of a Capri afternoon. She did not stand when I came in. She said, "Where do you want me?" I said, "Where you are is good." She said, "Move me if I am not." I lifted the camera. I did not use a tripod. I was shooting natural light at a wide aperture, and I knew the camera in my hands the way I knew my own hands, and I did not need anything between us. I took the first frame, I took the second, I took the third. She did not pose, she did not perform. She sat in the chair and watched me work, and her eyes did the small things eyes do when a person is being looked at by someone who is not flattering them. The eyes settle, the eyes stop performing. The eyes become the eyes the person has when they are alone in a room with a book. I took 6 frames. I lowered the camera. She said, "That was fast." I said, "I had 6. She said, "Show me where to stand if you want more." I said, "I do not want more. I have what I came for." She said, "You are very certain." I said, "I am certain about photographs. I am not always certain about other things." She said, "Which other things?" I said, "I do not know yet." She said, "All right." She did not move from the chair. I did not move from where I was standing, 4 feet from her, the camera held loose in my left hand, the strap around my neck. The library held the silence the way old libraries hold silence, with thickness, as if the books had been absorbing voices for 200 years and had developed a tolerance for the next one. She said, "Come here." I came 1 step closer. She said, "Closer." I came 1 more. She said, "Closer." I came until I was standing directly in front of the chair. The toes of my boots were perhaps 4 inches from the toes of her shoes. She was looking up at me from the chair. I was looking down at her. The angle was not, I understood with a slow internal heat, an angle she would have ever permitted herself to be photographed in. The angle was for me. She said, "I want to see what you saw." I said, "I will develop the negatives tonight." She said, "I want to see now." I said, "I cannot show you now. The film is in the camera." She said, "Show me what is on the back of the camera." I said, "I have been shooting film all morning. There is nothing on the back." She said, "Then describe it to me." I said, "Vittoria." She said, "Yes." I said, "If I describe it to you, I will be telling you what I think when I am looking at you, not what the camera saw." She said, "I am aware." I said, "All right." I knelt. I do not know why I knelt. I knelt because she was sitting and I was standing, and the conversation we were about to have was the kind of conversation that should not be had with one person looking down at the other. I knelt, and I set the camera on the floor beside me, and I put my hands on my knees, and I looked at her at the level of her face, 4 feet from her, in the deep yellow light of an afternoon in a house I had been hired to photograph. And I told her what I had seen. I said, I saw a woman who has been alone in this room a very long time. I saw a woman who knows how she looks at other people, and has not, in many years, let another person look at her in return. I saw a woman who lowered her eyes for a quarter of a second when I lifted the camera the first time, and lifted them back up before I could be sure of what I had seen. I saw a woman who has very precise hands. I saw a woman who was wearing a watch her grandfather wore. I saw a woman who has been the most powerful person in every room she has been in for so long that she has forgotten what it is to be looked at by someone who is not afraid of her. I saw a woman who is being looked at right now by someone who is not afraid of her. I saw a woman who is deciding whether that is a thing she can stand. She did not say anything for a long second. Her eyes had not moved from mine. She said, "How did you know about the watch?" I said, "You touched it once when I came in, the way people touch a thing they have been wearing for someone else, not for themselves." She said, "You are very observant." I said, "I am paid to be." She said, "You are not being paid for this." I said, "No, this is for me." She said, "What else is for you?" I said, "This conversation, this room, the chair you are sitting in, the way you said my name last night, the fact that you did not let me develop the photograph of you in front of anyone but yourself, the fact that you set a glass of water in the darkroom before I had ever come up the cliff." She said, "How did you know I set the glass?" I said, "Renata does not put glasses of water in the rooms of women she has not yet decided whether to like." She closed her eyes for half a second. She opened them. She said, "Dahlia." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do not stand up yet." I said I was not going to. She set her hand on the arm of the chair. She did not move her hand toward me. She set it on the arm of the chair, the way a woman sets a hand on an arm of a chair when she has decided that the next move is hers, and she is preparing to make it carefully. She said, "I am going to ask you a question. You are going to answer the question with the same accuracy you have been answering every other question I have asked you since you walked into my library. Are we clear?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you take this assignment because of who I am?" I said, "I took it because of the money." She said, "Be more specific." I said, "I took it because the money was enough that I did not ask who you were until I was on the train." She said, "When you found out who I was?" I said, "I almost canceled." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I have a rule about photographing women who are richer than every person I have ever met combined." She said, "What is the rule?" I said, "The rule is do not." She said, "Why did you break it?" I said, "Because I had already signed the contract, and the woman who hired me had structured the contract in such a way that breaking it would have ended my career." She said, "I know. I structured the contract that way on purpose." I said, "I know you did." She said, "Why did you not mind?" I said, "Because I had already decided by the time I read the second clause that the woman who had structured the contract that way was a woman I wanted to meet." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because no one structures a contract that way unless they are afraid of being told no." She said, "And?" I said, "And I do not meet many people who are afraid of being told no by me." She closed her eyes, this time for a full second. When she opened them, the gray of her eyes had darkened by a measurable amount in the yellow light. The fleck of green at the edge had gone. The eyes were the eyes of a woman who had been holding something in her chest for a long time and had just decided in the space of 1 second to set it down. She said, "Stand up." I stood up. She said, "Sit." I sat in the chair across from her. The chair I had sat in the night before. The chair I now understood that she had positioned across from her for a reason. The chair that was close enough to her chair that a person sitting in one could lean forward and almost touch a person sitting in the other. The chair that had been waiting since the moment I had walked into the library on the first day. She said, "I am going to tell you what is going to happen this week." I said, "All right." She said, "You are going to photograph the villa. You are going to photograph the chapel. You are going to photograph the cellars and the boathouse and the cliff and the gardens. You are going to do the work I have hired you to do. You are going to do it the way you have been doing it, which is well. At the end of every day, you are going to develop the day's role in the darkroom. And at the end of every day, you are going to come to this library and you are going to bring me one photograph that is not of the villa. One photograph of me." I said, "All right." She said, "I am going to keep each one." I said, "All right." She said, "I am also going to tell you on the day you give me the last photograph what I am going to do with all of them." I said, "All right." She said, "Are you not going to ask me what I am going to do with them?" I said, "No." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you have just told me you are going to tell me on the last day." She said, "What if I told you that what I am going to do with them depends on what you do with the days between now and then?" I said, "Then I will be careful with the days." She said, "What if I told you that what I am going to do with them depends on what I decide about you, and what I decide about you depends on whether you are still here on the 7th evening, or whether you have decided to leave?" I said, "I am not going to leave." She said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because I have not been told to." She said, "Dahlia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am not going to tell you to." I said, "I know." She said, "Go," and worked. I worked the rest of the afternoon on the boathouse. I worked at golden hour on the cliff. I came back at sundown with 3 rolls. I went to the darkroom. I worked until almost midnight. I produced a contact sheet for each roll. I selected the frames I would print. I printed them. I rinsed them. I clipped them to the line. I selected one frame from the second roll. The second roll was the library. The frame I selected was the third one. The third frame was Vittoria looking past me at something I had not been able to see, with her left hand resting on the arm of the chair, with the light from the window catching the edge of her cheekbone the way light catches the edge of a thing the photographer has decided is the most important thing in the photograph. I climbed the stairs to the library at midnight. She was awake. She had not changed. She said, "Show me." I held out the print. She took it. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at it for so long that I had time to count the floor tiles in the library, which were small and patterned and very old, and I counted them twice before she spoke. She said, "This is the one I am keeping forever." I said, "There are 6 more days." She said, "I am keeping this one forever. I will tell you on the 7th day what I am keeping the others as." I said, "All right." She said, "Good night, Dahlia." I said, "Good night, Vittoria." I went to my room. I did not sleep until almost 4. The 3rd day I shot the cellars. The 4th day I shot the chapel. The 5th day I shot the gardens at 3 different times of light. Every evening I developed the roles. Every evening I selected one frame of her. Every evening I climbed to the library at midnight and held out the print. She always took it. She always looked at it for longer than the photograph needed. She always said, "Good night, Dahlia." I always said, "Good night, Vittoria." The frame on the 3rd evening was her hand on the bowl of figs that she had carried with her into the library because she had been eating one when I had come in to set up. The frame on the 4th evening was the back of her neck. She had been standing at the window. She had not known I had taken it. She knew the second she saw it. that I had taken it without her knowing, because her eyes lifted from the print to mine and held for a beat, and she did not say anything, and I did not say anything, and she kept the photograph. The frame on the fifth evening was her bare foot on the warm stone of the upper terrace. She had been standing on the terrace at sundown, the way she had been standing on the terrace the first night, the way she stood on the terrace. I had begun to understand, every night at this hour, because this hour was hers. She had been wearing the wine-colored dress again. She had not turned when I had come up the steps. I had not photographed her face. I had photographed her foot, the bare foot, the warm stone, the hem of the wine-colored dress, lifted by the wind by perhaps 2 inches, falling back. When I gave her the print at midnight, she looked at it for a very long time. She said, "I have not been photographed like this since I was 22. I said, "I am sorry." She said, "Do not be." I said, "I will not." She said, "Good night, Dahlia." I said, "Good night, Vittoria." The 6th day was the day I developed the photograph I had not yet shown her. I had taken it on the 4th afternoon. She had been in the library. She had been reading. I had been changing roles in the corner. She had not known I was looking up. She had not known I had lifted the camera. She had not known I had taken a single frame of her, with the book open in her lap, and her thumb against the edge of a page, and her face composed in the way it composed when she did not know any human eye was on her. The face had been, I had understood, looking through the viewfinder, the face she had not let me photograph in any of the formal sittings. The face she had not let me photograph because she had not known it existed in a form a camera could capture. The face of a woman alone in a room with a book at the end of an afternoon, with no one in the chair across from her, with no one asking her any questions, with no one waiting for her to say anything important. The face of a woman who had been alone for 11 years. I had developed it on the 5th night and put it in glassine and set it at the bottom of my bag and not climbed the stairs to the library with it. On the 6th night, I climbed the stairs to a library with it. She said, "Show me." I held out the print. She took it. She looked at it. She did not speak. She looked at it for what was perhaps 3 minutes. I did not count this time. When she lifted her eyes from the print to mine, the gray of her eyes was wet. She had not cried. She had not let any of the wet leave her eyes. She was holding it the way she held everything, in containment, with the discipline of a woman who had been the most powerful person in every room she had been in for so long that she had forgotten how to set things down. She said, "When did you take this?" I said, "On the 4th afternoon, while you were reading. I had been changing roles. You did not see me." She said, "Why did you wait?" I said, "Because I was not going to give it to you until I knew what I was giving it for." She said, "And tonight you know." I said, "Tonight I know." She said, "Tell me." I said, "I am giving it to you because tomorrow is the 7th day, and tomorrow you will tell me what you are going to do with all the photographs, and I want you to make the decision about the others having seen this one." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because this is the photograph that tells the truth about why you let me take any of them." She said, "Dahlia." I said, "Yes." She said, "Sit down." I sat in the chair across from her. She set the print on the table between us, face up. She said, "I am going to tell you something now, and you are going to listen." I said, "All right." She said, "I have not been seen in 11 years. 11 years ago, I was photographed by a man I was married to, who took photographs of me as a way of holding the parts of me he could not control. He took thousands of photographs. He kept them in a room. After he died, I burned every one. I have not allowed anyone to photograph me since. I hired you. because 3 intermediaries told me that you were the best photographer in Italy, under 40, who would still take film commissions, and also the best photographer in Italy under 40 who could be trusted with a non-disclosure agreement that would survive my lawyers. I hired you because I wanted the chapel and the cellars and the cliff documented before I die, which I do not intend to do for a long time, but which I have been preparing for since I was 22. I did not hire you to photograph me. I did not intend to be photographed. I did not even intend to be in the same room as you for more than the first interview. I said, I know. She said, how? I said, because the contract did not include any sittings. She said, I changed my mind on the first evening. I said, I know. She said, how? I said, because the photograph of you on the upper terrace was the first thing my hands did before my mind had made any decisions. She said, Dahlia. I said, yes. She said, I am not going to do anything with these photographs. I said, all right. She said, I am going to keep them in a box in this library. I am going to look at them. I am not going to show them to anyone. I am not going to publish them. I am not going to leave them to anyone in a will. I am going to keep them for myself for the same reason a person keeps a letter from a person who once knew them, which is that the photographs prove I was for 7 days in March looked at by someone who saw me. I said, you were. She said, I know. She lifted the print of the woman with the book. She held it in her hands. She looked at it. She said, I am keeping this one separately. I said, where? She said, on a shelf above my bed, so that the last thing I see at night is the face you saw in me when I did not know I was being looked at. I had to look away for a second. I had to look at the floor and count the small tiles I had counted on the second night, and I had to count them all the way through before I could lift my eyes to her face. When I lifted them, she was still looking at the print. She said, Dahlia. I said, yes. She said, I am not going to ask you to stay. I said, I know. She said, I am also not going to ask you to leave. I said, I know. She said, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to finish the work tomorrow. I am going to develop the last roll. I am going to bring you the last photograph at midnight. I am going to leave on the morning of the 8th day because the contract ends on the 8th day. I am going to write you a letter when I get home. I am going to put my address in the letter. And I am going to wait. She said, for what? I said, for you to decide whether the 11 years end this week, or whether they do not. She said, Dahlia. I said, yes. She said, what if I cannot decide? I said, then I will wait longer. She said, what if I never decide? I said, then I will have spent some part of my life knowing a woman who let me photograph her once, which is a thing very few people in the world have been allowed to do, and I will count it as a kind of luck. She set the print of the woman with the book on top of the others on the table. She set her hand on top of the stack. She left her hand there. She said, good night, Dahlia. I said, good night, Vittoria. I went to my room. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat at the small writing desk by the window. I wrote her the letter I had told her I would write. I did not seal it. I left it folded on the desk, address side up. I would, I had decided, give her the option of taking it before I left, or letting me carry it home. The 7th day was a long day. I shot what I had not yet shot. I developed the last roll. I selected one final photograph of her. The final photograph was one I had taken at lunch. She had been laughing. She had been laughing at something Renata had said in Italian that I had not entirely understood. She had been laughing the way a woman laughs when she has not laughed in a long time, and has forgotten that her laugh has a particular shape, and is hearing the shape of it for the first time after 11 years, and is surprised by it. I climbed to the library at midnight with the final photograph. She was waiting. She had not changed. She was wearing the wine-colored dress. She said, "Show me." I held out the print. She took it. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "I had forgotten I sounded like that." I said, "It is a good sound." She said, "Yes." She set the photograph on the table on top of the stack. She said, "Dahlia." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am keeping all of these." I said, "I know." She said, "I am also keeping the letter you wrote me last night." I said, "How do you know about the letter?" She said, "I do not. I am telling you that if you have written one, I am keeping it." "Did you write one?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Where is it?" I said, "On the writing desk in my room, address side up." She said, "I will collect it before you leave." I said, "All right." She said, "I am not coming to the train with you tomorrow." I said, "I know." She said, "Renata will drive you." I said, "All right." She said, "I am going to be in this room when you leave. I am going to be sitting in this chair. I am going to be reading a book. I am not going to come to the door. I am not going to come to the window. I am not going to look at the car as it pulls away. Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you understand why?" I said, "Because if you come to the door, you have made the decision you have not yet made." She said, "Yes." I said, "I will not look back at the window." She said, "Thank you." I said, "I will write again from home." She said, "I know." I said, "Good night, Vittoria." She said, "Good night, Dahlia." I went to my room. I packed. I slept for 2 hours. I woke at 5. I went down at 6. Renata had laid out coffee and bread and figs and honey on a table in the courtyard. The car was waiting. I drank the coffee. I ate the bread. I did not go to the library. I got in the car. The car pulled away from the villa, down the long gravel drive between the cypresses. I did not look at the library window. I did not look at the upper terrace. I did not look at the cliff. I looked at the road. I looked at the back of Renata's head. At the bottom of the drive, where the gravel met the road, the car slowed for the gate. I looked. I could not help it. The library window was at the corner of the east wing, 3 stories up, framed in stone the color of butter. The window was open. The curtain had moved in the morning wind. There was no one at the window. There was no one in the door. There was no one on the upper terrace. The villa was the villa I had been hired to photograph. It had returned to itself. It had become again the building that had been there for 200 years before me, and would be there for 200 years after me. Then, in the upper corner of the library window, for a half-second, there was a hand, a pale hand on the inside of the curtain, holding the curtain back perhaps 2 inches. The hand was there for a half-second. Then it was gone. I turned forward in my seat. I did not say anything to Renata. The car pulled out onto the road. I watched the cypresses go by. I am sitting now in my apartment in Rome. It is the 2nd week of April. It has been 12 days since I left Capri. I have not heard from her. I did not expect to. The letter I left on the desk was 3 pages long, and I told her in it that I would wait. And waiting is the kind of thing you do not announce twice. The photographs I made for her are in a box in her library. The photograph of the woman with the book is on a shelf above her bed. The photograph that is in my own apartment, the only one I kept, the one I made a copy of at the very last moment in the darkroom on the 7th evening because my hands had decided I would need it, is the photograph of her bare foot on the warm stone of the upper terrace, with the hem of the wine-colored dress lifted by the wind by perhaps 2 inches, falling back. I have it on my wall. I look at it every morning. I am still waiting. If you want to hear what happens next, what I left out of this version, what was in the letter, and what I have not told anyone about the 7th evening before I climbed to the library at midnight, that's on my Patreon. The link is in the description below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.